Picture this. It's 1794. The air smells faintly of wood smoke, mud, and moonshine. A tired farmer wipes his hands on his worn shirt, peers across his field, and mutters something very American and very angry about taxes. Now picture George Washington, the hero of independence, the nation's first president, the man carved in marble and legend, sitting on a horse, in full military uniform, leading nearly 13,000 troops westward through Pennsylvania, against farmers who make whiskey. It sounds like a joke, a fever dream, something from the cutting room floor of history, but it really happened, and it might be one of the strangest, most quietly hilarious and somehow deeply important moments in early American history. Welcome, dreamer, to Sleepy Dreamer in America, the show where we take the wildest corners of American history, slow them down, smooth them out, and turn them into hour-long lullabies. Tonight's story is about rebellion, taxes, and whiskey. Three things Americans have always had strong opinions about. So lie back. Let your mind drift to the soft flicker of candlelight on wood walls. Imagine the sound of rain on a tin roof, the faint clink of glass and the rustle of pages turning in an old history book. Because tonight, we're not just talking about whiskey. We're talking about the moment America almost split itself apart, not over ideology or territory, but over the right to distill corn into something strong enough to burn the truth right out of your throat. The Whiskey Rebellion, a story that begins with ambition, grows with frustration, and ends with one of the most ironic military moments in presidential history. To understand it, we have to rewind back to the 1790s, when the United States was less a united anything and more a very polite experiment. A baby nation with creaky bones, empty pockets, and wildly differing opinions about what freedom really meant. Now, in the soft glow of your imagination, picture this. The American Revolution is over. The ink on the Constitution is barely dry. The Founding Fathers are scattered across the new country like chess pieces, half of them trying to build order, the other half still trying to remember what order was. And in the midst of it all, one man, the young nation's financial prodigy, sits at his desk surrounded by ledgers, maps, and the faint smell of ink. Alexander Hamilton. He has a plan, a big one. He wants to pay off the enormous war debt, stabilize the economy, and make the United States something more than a collection of hopeful farmers and former soldiers. He envisions a nation of commerce, industry, and solid credit, the kind of country Europe might actually lend money to without laughing. But there's a problem. Actually, there are several. The government is broke, the treasury is empty, and the word tax in post-revolutionary America is roughly as popular as mosquito at a picnic. Still, Hamilton, ever the bold visionary, proposes something radical, a new federal tax on distilled spirits, whiskey specifically. Now, to the well-dressed gentleman of Philadelphia, this makes perfect sense. It's practical, efficient, and elegant, a way to generate revenue from a luxury item. After all, what could go wrong with taxing whiskey? The answer, of course, is everything. Because while Hamilton saw whiskey as a luxury, farmers on the western frontier saw it as a lifeline. To them, whiskey wasn't a drink, it was money. A currency you could trade, store, and even pay your debts with. In a region with few banks, fewer coins, and even fewer smiles from tax collectors, whiskey was liquid gold. And now, the government, the very government these farmers had fought to create, wanted to tax it. You can probably hear the slow, building rumble of rebellion already. But for now, let's pause here, in the twilight between peace and protest. Let's imagine those farmers, tough, independent, slightly muddy men and women living on the edge of civilization. They'd fought in the Revolution, believed in liberty, and had a deep spiritual connection to their stills. Whiskey wasn't just business. It was survival, identity, and, let's be honest, recreation. When word of the new tax spread across the Appalachians, it traveled slower than gossip, but with the same potency. When it arrived, it hit like a thunderclap. Tax on whiskey? They said. Didn't we just fight a war about that kind of nonsense? And thus, the scene was set. A baby nation struggling to find its footing. A financial genius trying to balance the books. A president caught between ideals and order. And a group of farmers who would rather fight than pay. It was absurd. It was serious. It was somehow perfectly American. So, as you lie back and let your breathing slow, imagine the hills of western Pennsylvania, the smoke from chimneys curling lazily into the cold air, the sound of hammers, axes, and maybe the distant drip of moonshine from a hidden still. Somewhere out there, history is about to bubble over, and not just in the stills. This is the story of the Whiskey Rebellion, the moment the young United States discovered that liberty, law, and liquor make for one combustible mix. Next, we'll slip deeper into the story, into the world of those frontier farmers, their struggles, their humor, and their stills. Because if you really want to understand rebellion, you have to start where it was distilled. To understand why farmers took up arms over whiskey, we have to look at what America was in the 1790s, and what it wasn't. It wasn't yet the United States you know today. There were no highways, no national anthem, and definitely no TikTok. The Union was more an idea than a certainty. 13 states stitched together with more hope than thread. The country was fragile. The revolution had left it proud but poor, united but deeply divided. There were still debts to pay, roads to build, treaties to sign, and a very large question hovering over everything. Could this new federal government actually govern? That was the question Alexander Hamilton woke up thinking about every morning, probably before his coffee and definitely before his patience ran out. Hamilton was the Treasury Secretary, a man of dazzling intellect, occasional arrogance, and an unshakable belief in math. He saw numbers the way poets saw sunsets, and he understood something that few others did at the time. You can't have independence without income. The revolution had been financed on credit. France had helped, sure, but there were bills. Enormous, terrifying, revolutionary-sized bills, and someone had to pay them. Hamilton's big idea was simple on paper, though deeply unpopular in practice. The new federal government would assume all state debts from the war and pay them off as a unified nation. It would create a central bank, establish federal credit, and build the economic backbone for the country's future. In other words, Hamilton was trying to turn a collection of rebellious farmers into a functioning government. And for that, he needed money, so he looked for revenue, something steady, reliable, and taxable. Imports were already taxed, land was difficult. And then, perhaps over an evening drink, inspiration struck. Distilled spirits. Whiskey. Not because Hamilton had anything against whiskey. He was probably quite fond of it. But it was one of the few things that almost everyone consumed. And more importantly, something that could generate consistent revenue. A tax on whiskey made sense to the economists of the East. To the legislators in Philadelphia, it was neat, clean, and efficient. And to the people in the West, it was outrageous. You see, in the eastern cities, whiskey was a beverage, a luxury, a weekend indulgence. But in the western frontier, western Pennsylvania, Kentucky, parts of Virginia, whiskey was the economy. These were rugged rural communities where coinage was rare, and barter was the currency of the day. A farmer might trade a gallon of whiskey for a bushel of corn, a haircut, or a favor. It was easier to transport whiskey than grain, less bulky, more valuable, and it didn't spoil. In some places, whiskey was as good as gold, only tastier, and now the government wanted to tax it by the gallon. To a frontier farmer, that felt less like financial policy and more like betrayal. They had just fought a war to throw off distant taxation. They had just declared independence from a king who never asked what life was like on their side of the ocean. And now this new government, their government, was doing something that felt suspiciously similar. The Western farmers began to grumble. Then they began to shout. taxation without representation, they said, dusting off the same slogan that had helped win the revolution. And in their defense, they weren't. Entirely wrong. Representation was tricky when you lived hundreds of miles from Philadelphia, and your mail took weeks to arrive, if it arrived at all. The federal tax, designed by urban men in fine coats, seemed utterly disconnected from the muddy boots and homemade stills of the frontier. But in the capital, Hamilton and his allies saw things differently. To them, this wasn't oppression. It was order. The government had to prove it could collect taxes, enforce laws, and sustain itself. Without that, the entire experiment of democracy might collapse into chaos. And so, in 1791, Congress passed the excise whiskey tax. The rate depended on how much you distilled. Large producers could pay an annual flat fee, while small producers had to pay by the gallon. Naturally, the small farmers were furious. The rich got cheaper taxes, the poor paid more per drop. The sense of injustice fermented faster than a batch of corn mash. Still, the government pressed on. Federal officials were dispatched to the western territories to register stills and collect the tax. They brought ledgers, stamps, and the sort of cheerful optimism only tax collectors have right before everything goes wrong. They were not welcomed. In taverns and barns, farmers gathered to vent their anger. They compared the tax to British tyranny, called Hamilton every creative insult imaginable, and began to talk about resistance. At first, it was mostly talk. Frontier bluster over a few drinks. But talk has a way of hardening into conviction, especially when shared among people who feel unheard. Letters started circulating, petitions were signed, and meetings were held. Farmers swore oaths to resist collection, and rumors spread that federal agents were marking down names for punishment. It was the 1790s equivalent of an angry comment section. Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, Hamilton wasn't exactly sympathetic. He saw the protests as proof of exactly what he'd been warning about: the need for a strong federal government capable of enforcing law. To him, resistance wasn't romantic. It was dangerous. And so the stage was set. A distant government, trying to build structure, and a local population trying to protect its freedom. Two parts of America, both right in their own way, both convinced the other had forgotten what liberty meant. Now imagine those long Appalachian valleys, mist rising from the trees, the quiet hum of a still, a few voices murmuring about fairness, about honor, about whiskey. It's quiet for now, but the barrels are heating. The pressure's rising, and as with all good stories, especially American ones, things are about to get a little louder. Next, in Part 3, Life on the Frontier, we'll slow down even further, step into the muddy boots of those farmers, and see what daily life was like before their whiskey became a cause worth fighting for. If you really want to understand why people got so angry about a whiskey tax, you have to understand what life was like on the American frontier. Because out there, on the edge of the young republic, whiskey wasn't just whiskey. It was culture, currency, comfort, and sometimes breakfast. Picture Western Pennsylvania in the 1790s. The roads, if you could call them that, were mostly mud. Horses trotted more slowly than politics. Towns were small clusters of cabins huddled around a mill or a tavern, and the nearest city was days away by foot, wagon, or hope. Life was rough but real. Every meal was earned, every roof was patched, and every neighbor knew exactly how many chickens you owned, and probably borrowed too last week. The frontier wasn't the land of wealth. It was the land of survival and community. And in that world, whiskey was more than a drink. It was a kind of social glue. Farmers grew grain, rye, barley, corn. But shipping it east was expensive and risky. The roads were poor, wagons broke, and markets were far away. A bushel of grain could rot before it reached a buyer. But if you distilled that grain into whiskey, suddenly it was portable, profitable, durable. Whiskey didn't spoil, didn't take up much space, and fetched a good price. It was a perfect frontier invention. Practical, economical, and, as an added bonus, pleasantly intoxicating. You could sell it, trade it, or drink it when your back hurt, which was always. You could pay debts with it, buy a cow with it, or impress your in-laws with a strong batch. In many towns, whiskey was as good as money. So when the government decided to tax it, it wasn't just taxing alcohol. It was taxing survival. Now imagine the typical day of a frontier farmer. He wakes before dawn with a back that sounds like a creaky door. The fields stretch endlessly before him. There's corn to cut, fences to mend, and tools to fix. His hands are rough, his boots worn, his patience short, and his sense of humor, blessedly, intact. He's not a politician. He's not a scholar. He's not even sure where Philadelphia is exactly. But he knows this. He fought in a revolution so that no one could tell him how to live his life. And now, men in coats and wigs are sending tax collectors across the mountains, asking for money he doesn't have, for whiskey he needs to survive. He does not take this well at the local tavern, which doubles as the courthouse, the community center, and on good nights, the dance hall. Talk begins to ferment as quickly as the whiskey. Someone slams a mug down and says, "It's just like King George all over again." Someone else nods and mutters, "Aye, but at least King George didn't pretend to be one of us." There's laughter. There's grumbling. There's a sense of betrayal that runs deeper than the barrels in the cellar. But there's also humor. Because frontier people, even when furious, were rarely humorless. They make jokes about paying taxes in corn mash. They give nicknames to the taxman. They raise toasts to liberty and rye. And somewhere between the jokes and the toasts, a dangerous thought begins to take hold. Maybe they don't have to obey. Because here's the thing. These are people used to doing things their own way. They've built their own homes, fought their own battles, and frankly, ignored most laws that didn't make sense to them. The idea of simply refusing a tax doesn't sound rebellious. It sounds reasonable. They start holding meetings, informal, smoky gatherings in barns and taverns, where men sit on barrels instead of chairs and talk about justice instead of crops. Some of them are veterans who remember fighting at Saratoga or Yorktown. Some have the scars to prove it, and they start to wonder if the revolution was really over or if it just changed uniforms. It's not just about money anymore, it's about dignity. You can almost see it. A candle flickering over their faces, the smell of wood smoke and rye heavy in the air. And someone saying quietly, "If we give in now, what's next? Taxes on bread? On air?" The idea of rebellion doesn't start as a shout. It starts as a whisper. And a shared feeling that the government, no matter how new or noble, has already forgotten the people who fought to make it possible. Meanwhile, the whiskey stills bubble away quietly, their fires glowing in the darkness. The drip, drip, drip of distilled freedom echoes through the valleys. A few miles away, a federal tax collector sharpens his quill, straightens his hat, and sets off toward another settlement. He doesn't know it yet, but he's walking into history, and maybe a small sticky puddle of tar. The frontier was a place of contradictions, hard-working yet defiant, poor yet proud, fiercely loyal to the idea of America, but suspicious of its government. Whiskey was just the spark. The fuel was resentment, frustration, and the deeply human desire to be left alone. So as you lie back, listening, imagine that world. Not the textbook version, but the real one. Muddy boots, loud taverns, smoky rooms, the sound of laughter, echoing between hills, followed by a quiet question. What do we do now? Because soon those whispers will become meetings. The meetings will become mobs. And before long, George Washington himself will be back in uniform, not fighting the British this time, but his own citizens. But that, dear dreamer, is a story for after the next yawn. The first sparks of rebellion didn't start with muskets or marching bands. They started, as most American rebellions do, with angry meetings, strong opinions, and whiskey. By 1792, the whiskey tax was in full effect, at least on paper. In reality, Collecting it was a bit like trying to collect rent from a bear. Technically possible, but not without risk. Federal officers, armed with ledgers and polite smiles, ventured into western Pennsylvania to register stills and gather taxes. Most didn't make it past the first tavern without realizing that friendly conversation could turn into hostile negotiation very quickly. Some farmers simply refused to pay. Others pretended not to understand the law. And a few took the more traditional frontier approach: intimidation, tar, and feathers. Tarring and feathering, of course, was the 18th century equivalent of an online roast, brutal, humiliating, and extremely effective. It sent a message. We don't just disagree with you. We'd also like you to shine in the moonlight. By the summer of 1792, resistance had spread like spilled whiskey. Angry crowds gathered, tax officials resigned, and federal law seemed to dissolve somewhere in the Allegheny Hills. Out in the frontier, committees began forming, informal councils of local leaders, veterans, and farmers who debated strategy. They sent letters to Congress demanding repeal, petitions to Washington pleading for fairness, and occasionally, very pointed notes to tax collectors suggesting career changes. At first, the federal government tried patience. It was a new nation. After all, maybe the people just needed time to cool off like a hot still after a long distillation. But the anger didn't cool. It thickened. By 1793, the rebellion had taken on a life of its own. Secret meetings were held in barns and back rooms. Liberty poles, wooden symbols of protest left over from the Revolution, were raised once more. And in the smoky haze of those gatherings, men began whispering about resistance by force. They spoke of liberty, fairness, and honor. They quoted the Declaration of Independence. Some even claimed that Washington himself would have stood with them if he'd understood their plight. But in Philadelphia, the whispers sounded like something else: sedition. You have to imagine what that must have felt like to Washington. The man who'd led a revolution for liberty now faced citizens using his own words against him. Meanwhile, out in western Pennsylvania, the rebellion was growing bolder and more theatrical. When tax collectors appeared, farmers gathered in mobs, sometimes hundreds strong, to chase them off. Effigies of officials were burned. Federal property was vandalized. One poor agent had his horse stolen, his hair cut, and his dignity permanently misplaced. Then, in July 1794, things boiled over. A U.S. Marshal arrived in western Pennsylvania to deliver subpoenas to farmers who hadn't paid the tax. It was supposed to be a routine trip: paperwork, signatures, handshakes. Instead, it became the match that lit the powder. He was joined by a tax inspector named John Neville, a proud, well-to-do man who had helped design the tax system itself. The locals didn't like Neville. In fact, they disliked him about as much as they liked whiskey, which is to say passionately, but in opposite directions. When Neville and the marshal arrived near Pittsburgh, they were met not by compliance, but by gunfire. Shots were exchanged. No one was sure who fired first. History's version of it wasn't me. But by the time the smoke cleared, one of the locals was dead. That night, hundreds of armed farmers surrounded Neville's home, known as Bower Hill. The siege began at dawn. The house caught fire. Shots echoed through the valley. When it ended, Neville's house was burned to the ground. The rebellion was no longer symbolic. It was real. Word spread fast as word could travel by horseback and rumor. The Whiskey Boys, as they were now called, began organizing militias of their own. Some spoke openly of independence, of breaking away from the United States altogether. To outsiders, it might have looked like chaos. To the rebels, it felt like justice. And amid all the smoke and shouting, a strange thought began to take hold. This wasn't just about whiskey anymore. It was about who held power in America: the East or the West, the government or the people, the wealthy or the working. For the farmers, it was about fairness. For Hamilton, it was about authority. For Washington, it was about survival, not of himself, but of the fragile republic he'd helped create. Because if the federal government couldn't enforce its own laws, was it really a government at all? The Whiskey Rebellion had become the first true test of American authority. A test that would send the President of the United States into the field in full uniform, leading troops to suppress his own citizens. But that's for the next chapter. For now picture the smoke still rising from Neville's burned home. Picture the hills, green, peaceful, unaware they've just become the stage for history. And somewhere in the distance, George Washington sets down a letter from Alexander Hamilton, rubs his temples, and sighs deeply. Next, in Part 5, Washington's dilemma. We'll follow that sigh all the way to the Capitol, where Washington wrestles with the question that every leader dreads. When your people rebel, how do you hold the nation together without breaking it apart? When George Washington first heard that armed farmers were attacking tax collectors in western Pennsylvania, his first reaction was not anger. It was exhaustion. He had thought, hoped, that his days of putting down rebellions were over. He had already fought one against the most powerful empire in the world. He had already watched good men die for liberty. And now, not 10 years after that hard-won victory, Americans were once again marching with muskets, this time against their own government. It was like watching your children finally move out, only to find out they've set the garage on fire. Washington had always been a man of patience and balance. He believed in strength, but he also believed in restraint. He knew that a single overreaction could break the delicate unity that held the young United States together. Still, the reports from the frontier grew worse. Federal marshals were being threatened. Local militias were organizing against federal authority. And John Neville's home, the tax inspector's grand estate, had gone up in flames. The whiskey rebels weren't just angry anymore. They were defiant. Meetings were being held openly where men swore to resist the government by force. There were rumors, and Washington hated rumors, that they planned to march on Pittsburgh, seize the local arsenal, and maybe even declare independence. Independence again. You can almost hear Washington sigh as he reads those reports. The ink on the Constitution was barely dry, and already the idea of rebellion was back on the table like a bad habit. He gathered his cabinet. Alexander, Hamilton, of course, pacing with righteous fury, Henry Knox, the calm voice of military reason, and Edmund Randolph, who preferred diplomacy over confrontation. The room must have been thick with tension, and maybe a little Hamilton monologue, because when Hamilton got going, there was no stopping him. He saw this as the ultimate test of federal authority. "This is it, sir," Hamilton probably said, thumping the table for emphasis. "If we allow this rebellion to stand, we will have no government at all. The Constitution will mean nothing. We must act decisively and with force." Washington, ever the listener, didn't respond immediately. He rubbed his chin, which could intimidate armies, and thought. He didn't want to send troops against his own people. That was the kind of thing kings did, not presidents. But he also knew what Hamilton was saying was true. If the new republic couldn't enforce its own laws, then it wasn't a republic. It was a suggestion. So Washington chose a middle path. First, he tried peace. He sent commissioners to Western Pennsylvania to negotiate. Their mission: listen, reason, and persuade. Remind the farmers that this was their government, that democracy meant sometimes losing the vote, not burning down the house. For a brief, flickering moment, it seemed like it might work. The commissioners met with local leaders, drank a little, whiskey, probably for diplomacy, and talked about reconciliation. But when they returned to Philadelphia, their report was grim. The rebels were unyielding. The talks had failed. And so, on September 15, 1794, Washington issued a proclamation, calm, clear, and devastatingly presidential. He called upon the insurgents to disperse and return to their homes. And he authorized the calling up of a militia force large enough to enforce federal law. That force would number nearly 13,000 men, more soldiers than he had commanded in most of the Revolution. Think about that for a moment. George Washington, the hero of independence, was about to lead an army against Americans. He didn't take that decision lightly. In private letters, he wrote about the pain of it, how much he hated the thought of using arms against fellow citizens. But he also wrote about duty. He saw this not as punishing rebellion, but as protecting the very idea of the United States, the rule of law, the strength of the Constitution, the survival of democracy itself. Washington wanted to make a point, so clear it would echo for centuries. The government of the United States would not be defied by mobs. So at 62 years old, with aching bones and a lifetime of war behind him, George Washington mounted his horse once more. He rode out from Philadelphia in his blue and buff uniform, just like the old days. The men cheered when they saw him. Farmers, blacksmiths, veterans, and young recruits who had grown up hearing his name spoken like a prayer. He looked older now, grayer, quieter. But when he spoke, the air still seemed to hold its breath. This wasn't a king leading an army to crush dissent. This was a president, proving that the Constitution was more than paper, that it could act, defend itself, and stand firm even when tested by its own children. Washington didn't intend to fight. He intended to show that the law had power, show that rebellion had consequences, show that liberty didn't mean anarchy. It meant responsibility. He called it a painful yet necessary duty. As his army marched westward, Hamilton rode alongside, practically glowing with vindication. He saw this as his great experiment in national strength coming to life. Washington, on the other hand, saw it as the saddest necessity of his presidency. The troops advanced slowly through rain and mud into the heart of the frontier. But when they arrived, something unexpected happened. There was no battle. The rebels, faced with the sight of thousands of disciplined soldiers led by Washington himself, simply melted away. The insurrection collapsed like a bad tent. Some men surrendered. Others went home quietly, pretending they had never been involved. The rebellion that had terrified the young nation dissolved without a single major skirmish. Washington accepted the surrender of a few leaders, oversaw brief trials, and soon afterward issued pardons to most. The message had been sent. The law had stood firm, and for the first time in history, the United States government had proven that it could and would enforce its own authority. Washington returned to Philadelphia, tired but proud. He had shown restraint, power, and mercy, all in one act. And perhaps as he finally sat down that evening, maybe with a quiet glass of the very thing that had caused all this trouble, he thought to himself, maybe now they'll let me retire. In peace. Spoiler, they would not. Next, in part 6, the aftermath, we'll see what happened once the smoke cleared, how the country reacted, how the rebels were treated, and how this strange whiskey crisis changed the future of federal power forever. When George Washington's army marched into western Pennsylvania in the autumn of 1794, the rebellion that had once roared through taverns and valleys simply evaporated. No grand battle, no climactic showdown, just silence, the sound of thousands of men realizing they'd picked the wrong fight with the wrong president. Washington's presence alone had done what muskets could not. The rebels had stared down the federal government and found themselves staring back at George Washington on a horse. There's a saying, you can't out-patriot George Washington. And in that moment, the whiskey rebels seemed to understand it perfectly. Washington took careful stock of the situation. He didn't gloat. He didn't punish broadly. He did what Washington always did best. He balanced power with mercy. Most of the rebels were pardoned. Only 2 men were convicted of treason. And even they were spared execution by presidential pardon. Washington wanted to make a point, not martyrs. He wrote that lenity and moderation would do more to restore order than vengeance. And it worked. Within weeks, the western counties returned to quiet. Whiskey still flowed, because, let's be honest, no one was about to stop drinking. But now it flowed under the watchful, slightly exasperated eye of the federal government. But while the muskets went silent, the debates did not. In Philadelphia, politicians argued about what the rebellion meant. Federalists, led by Hamilton, hailed it as a triumph of law and order, proof that the government could enforce its authority. They said it showed the Constitution had real strength. The opposition, led by Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans, saw something else. To them, it looked like federal overreach, an unnecessary show of force against ordinary citizens. Jefferson famously wrote that the rebellion had been excited by an oppressive tax, and that sending troops was like using a sledgehammer to kill a gnat. Jefferson's allies painted Hamilton as a would-be monarch, the sort of man who'd tax your whiskey today and your happiness tomorrow. And Hamilton, of course, responded with essays. Lots of essays. He defended the tax, the action, the army, and probably his hairstyle. He argued that liberty must always be balanced by law, and that rebellion, if unchecked, would destroy the republic faster than any foreign army. The country's newspapers buzzed with editorials, poems, and political cartoons. One popular illustration showed Washington riding down whiskey barrels like a conquering hero. Another showed the whiskey rebels kneeling before the federal eagle, which, to be fair, was a little dramatic. But beyond the politics and the pamphlets, something deeper had changed. The United States had faced its first real test of federal authority, and passed. Before the Whiskey Rebellion, the Constitution was a promise. After it, it was a fact. The new government had shown that it could raise an army, march across the states, and enforce the law, peacefully, decisively, and under civilian control. No kings, no coups. Just a functioning republic doing what republics are supposed to do. It was a moment that shaped the young nation's future in ways its participants couldn't have imagined. For one, it set a precedent. Future presidents, from Jefferson to Lincoln, would look back on Washington's handling of the Whiskey Rebellion as a model, firm when necessary, restrained when possible. It also deepened the divide between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, a divide that would soon blossom into America's first true party system. And out on the frontier, it left a mark too. Many farmers never forgot the sting of the whiskey tax. Some saw the rebellion's end as proof that the government favored the wealthy, the Eastern elites who could afford lawyers and lobbyists, while the frontier folks had only their stills and their stubbornness. Even after the tax was repealed, in 1802, under Jefferson's presidency, the memory lingered. In taverns from Pittsburgh to Kentucky, people still told stories about the time they'd nearly fought George Washington, and how, wisely, they'd decided not to. And then there's the quieter lesson. The Whiskey Rebellion reminded America that liberty isn't just about shouting freedom and ignoring the law. It's about creating a system strong enough to survive disagreement. Washington had shown that strength doesn't always mean violence, and that unity doesn't always mean agreement. Sometimes it just means not falling apart. He left office 2 years later, warning the nation in his farewell address to avoid factions, political divisions that could tear the young republic apart. It was as if he already knew that the next battles would not be fought with muskets, but with words and elections. Those hills still stand today. The farms are green, the rivers shine, and somewhere tucked between the trees you can still find the ruins of old stills, moss-covered stones where once whiskey and rebellion flowed together. And if you listen carefully, on a still evening, with a glass of something smooth in hand, you might almost hear the faint echo of voices long gone, men laughing, arguing, toasting, swearing, singing. Voices that believed in liberty, even when they couldn't quite agree on what it meant. Next, in Part 7, The Legacy of the Whiskey Rebellion, we'll explore how this strange uprising echoed through the centuries, shaping presidents, policies, and even America's relationship with protest itself. The guns are silent now. The fields have gone back to growing grain, not grievances. The smoke has cleared from Bower Hill, but the Whiskey Rebellion never really ended. It just settled into the folds of history, quietly, stubbornly, like a hangover that lasted 2 centuries, because while the fighting stopped, the questions it raised never quite went away. What does liberty mean? How much power should the government have? And what happens when citizens disagree so deeply with authority that they decide to defy it? Those questions are as American as the frontier itself. The legacy of the Whiskey Rebellion is not just in the past. It's woven into the country's DNA. For one thing, it established the federal government's right and responsibility to enforce the law. Before 1794, that was more theory than practice. After the rebellion, it was a proven fact. You could be as independent and ornery as you liked, but when the law came knocking, the law was real. That principle would echo later in crises far larger than the whiskey tax. When southern states tried to secede in 1861, when civil rights activists demanded equality in the 1960s, when governors and presidents clashed over who held authority, the spirit of that moment in 1794 hovered quietly in the background. Washington had set a precedent, and once you set a precedent in America, it tends to stick around. Of course, not all of the rebellion's legacy was about government power. It also left behind a very American form of defiance, the belief that ordinary people should question authority, loudly, sometimes drunkenly, but always passionately. There's a straight line, slightly wobbly, but there. From the whiskey rebels of 1794 to the protests, movements, and marches that would come centuries later. Every time Americans stand up and say, "We disagree," they're echoing that same frontier stubbornness. They're channeling a little of that whiskey fire. And maybe, just maybe, that's a good thing. Because the truth is, the Whiskey Rebellion wasn't really about whiskey. It was about identity, about what kind of country America was going to. Would it be a collection of small, self-governing communities who answered only to themselves? Or a single, unified nation bound by common laws and institutions? Washington and Hamilton believed in unity through structure, that a strong federal government was the backbone of liberty. The farmers of western Pennsylvania believed in liberty through independence, that freedom meant no distant authority telling them what to do. Both sides, in their own way, were right. That tension between freedom and order still hums quietly under everything America does. It's the country's heartbeat, sometimes steady, sometimes erratic, but always there. The rebellion also revealed something else, something deeply human. It showed how fragile the idea of a nation really is, how easy it is for frustration to turn into fury, and how vital it is for leadership to balance empathy with strength. Washington understood that. He knew he could crush the rebellion militarily, but he chose to calm it instead, with mercy, with presence, and with just enough discipline to remind the world that liberty and law could live side by side. And maybe that's why, even after all these years, the Whiskey Rebellion feels more like a parable than an uprising. It's a reminder that democracy isn't a straight line. It's a balancing act, a careful dance between power and protest, authority and dissent, whiskey and reason. In the years that followed, the whiskey tax itself faded away. It was repealed in 1802 by President Thomas Jefferson, who probably raised a glass to celebrate. The frontier farmers went back to their fields and stills, and the young republic went on to face bigger storms. But the memory of that rebellion lingered, a story told in taverns and history books, in lectures and bedtime tales like this one, because even if most Americans don't remember every detail, they remember the feeling, the image of George Washington, riding west at 62 years old, not to conquer, but to remind his people that they were one nation, imperfect, noisy, divided but one. So what's the real legacy of the Whiskey Rebellion? Maybe it's that America learned something vital about itself, that it could argue fiercely, rebel loudly, and still survive. Maybe it's that leadership sometimes means marching into danger not to fight, but to be seen. Or maybe, and I think Washington would like this one, it's that democracy, like whiskey, takes time to mature. It needs patience, care, and just the right amount of heat to bring out the good stuff. And in that way, every protest, every debate, Every loud and messy argument since then has been just another batch, distilled from the same restless American spirit. So here we are, dear dreamer, at the end of our journey through smoke barrels and frontier rebellion. The Whiskey Rebellion. At first glance might seem like a small story. Attacks, a few angry farmers, and George Washington riding west like a fatherly general of bedtime justice. But in truth, it was much bigger than that. It was a story about balance, about freedom and law, about the delicate dance between individual rights and collective responsibility, about the young United States learning very painfully that liberty was not simply the absence of rules, but the careful practice of them. Think of the hills of western Pennsylvania, where farmers once poured their spirits into barrels and anger into meetings. Think of Neville's burned house, the whispered threats, the nights of planning and plotting. Imagine Washington, sitting tall on his horse, watching not enemies but fellow citizens stumble along the path of law and liberty. And then, imagine it all quiet. The smoke is cleared. The tax is repealed. The farmers are back to their fields. The whiskey is flowing again. And the country, fragile, imperfect, human, endures. The rebellion teaches us something subtle, almost like a whisper as you drift toward sleep. That America's strength lies not in the absence of conflict, but in its ability to survive it. It reminds us that every protest, every debate, every raised voice or fist has a place in the story. That leaders sometimes must be firm, sometimes gentle, and always attentive to the people they serve. And of course, it reminds us, with a wry smile, that sometimes history boils down to a few stubborn farmers, a tax, and a lot of whiskey. It's absurd. It's human. It's American. So as you lie back, letting your body sink into the soft embrace of the night, let your mind wander to those rolling hills, the faint glow of lanterns in frontier cabins, the gentle murmur of conversation over barrels and stills, the distant sound of a horse's hooves in the dark. And let yourself drift, past tax collectors, past militias, past the ghosts of the rebellion, into sleep. Because the story of the Whiskey Rebellion, like all great American stories, isn't really about whiskey or taxes or even rebellion. It's about us, our stubbornness, our courage, our mistakes, and our quiet, remarkable ability to endure. Tonight, the hills are calm. The whiskey is tucked safely in barrels. The nation, young, fragile, and full of promise, breathes slowly. And now so can you. Sleep well, dreamer. And remember, sometimes history isn't just a story to learn from. It's a story to dream to.